Hello everybody, this is Joan coming to you from Joan's Kitchen. I hope that everybody is enjoying a safe and comfortable Labor Day holiday today. And today, Labor Day kind of signifies the traditional end of the summer holiday, even though it's really hot here in a lot of different parts of the country. But I'm preparing a soup that would be something that would be a nice, comforting and tasty dish to have as we start getting into the cooler fall nights. This is a dish that's called Albondigas. And Albondigas is basically a Mexican meatball soup. There's an equivalent in a lot of different cultures. I know actually in Portugal, the same thing is called Albondigas, just the way that they pronounce it there. And there's similar dishes in many, many cuisines. As always, if you have any questions while I'm going through this, please go ahead and drop them in the comments, and I will do my very best to answer, whether it's live right now or on the replay a little bit later. I would love to get back to you with answers. There are basically three components to this dish. There's chicken stock, which is the base for the soup, and then there's something that's called a recaudo. It's R-E-C-A-U-D-O. It's a Spanish word that means a collection, and it's similar to what you might know as a sofrito or sazon, which is a collection of different ingredients to kind of flavor the broth. So in this case, my sofrito has onion in it, and garlic, and also some sliced carrots, and there's also breadcrumbs, and the breadcrumbs get a little bit toasty before we add them to the stock, and they also serve to thicken up the sauce a little bit. And then there are going to be some crushed tomatoes in there as well. So I already have my onions and garlic chopped up. There's also a tiny bit of cumin in here, which is a seasoning, and I've got my pan going here, so I'm going to go ahead and start sauteing this. I'm going to turn it down just a little bit. I'm going to add my carrots in here. I'm going to wait a little bit to add the breadcrumbs until the onions have started to really kind of soften up. And I'm going to let that go for a minute, and I'm going to start on the other component of that, which is the meatballs. This recipe that I'm making is the way that my mother and grandmother made it, and this has ground pork in it. Ground pork is something that you're typically going to find in your grocery store already prepackaged. They're not going to be grinding pork in their machines right at the grocery store, because the pork can, if it has any kind of a bacteria, can contaminate their grinder. So typically this is going to come already pre-ground from outside of the store in a package like this. The meatballs also have 2 eggs in them, and the meatballs are also flavored. There's herbs, so there's fresh oregano, which is right here, and I've chopped that up, and then there's also dried thyme, and then they also have raw rice that gets mixed into the meatballs. So while my recaudo is going over here, I'm going to go ahead and get the meatballs going. You start out by cracking your eggs, and then we're going to be mixing the seasonings in with the eggs before we mix the meat in by hand. So I've got my 2 eggs here, I've got my thyme, I have my chopped up fresh oregano, and I have my rice. Just give this a little stir here. So I'm going to go ahead and beat this up here, just to mix the eggs a little bit. And then I'm going to add my pork to this. It's about 1.5 pounds of pork. I actually made a test batch of this the other day, so I started out with 3 pounds of pork, and this is the 1.5 pounds that's remaining here. And while that's going on, my onions and carrots have started to get relatively soft here in this frying pan, so I'm going to go ahead and add my breadcrumbs to that. The other ingredient that's going to be going into this recaudo or sofrito is some tomatoes, and these are crushed tomatoes. Crushed tomatoes are a little bit more liquidy than chopped tomatoes, and I'm using these canned ones that are from Italy. So these are crushed tomatoes, and just to show you the consistency of this, I'm going to spoon a little bit of it out here so you can see what it looks like. It's not as smooth as a tomato sauce or as a tomato puree, but it's not as chunky as just plain old chopped tomatoes. And those tomatoes are just going to go right here into this sauce. I'm using homemade chicken stock for this, but you can use the kind of stock that comes in a box or a bottle. If you have homemade, that's always nice to use. I tend to use rotisserie chickens a lot, and when I use a rotisserie chicken, I save the skin and the bones, and I keep a couple of those in the freezer, and then when I'm ready to make stock, I just throw it in a stock pot with a whole onion, a couple pieces of carrots, and some celery, some garlic, some bay, and some peppercorns, and just let it go. And then I keep it in quart-sized bottles in my freezer, so it's nice to be able to pull it out of the freezer. So my sofrito or ricotto looks like this. So it's basically the sauteed onions, the sauteed carrots, there's a little bit of garlic in there, a little bit of cumin, the breadcrumbs, and now the tomatoes. And I'm going to switch this out. And I have my chicken stock here, which I had already started warming before going on the air here. And this ricotto is going to get mixed into the chicken stock, and that's going to be the basis for our soup. So it's basically plain chicken stock, but with that seasoning, which was the tomatoes, the onions, the carrots, a little bit of cumin, a little bit of garlic, and the breadcrumbs. And that's going to get mixed in here, and then ultimately the meatballs are going to be cooked inside of that. So while that's warming up again, because it has to be simmering before I add the meatballs, I'm going to go ahead and just mix the eggs and the seasonings and the rice here with the raw pork. You don't want to overmix the stuff because it gets tough if you do that, but you do want to have it mixed together so that the meat is nicely seasoned with the herbs. Remember, there's fresh oregano in here, and there is also dried thyme, so it has a nice flavor. The soup itself doesn't really taste like a tomatoey soup. It's a really nice flavor, and then you get some of the flavor of the meat that also is going to get mixed into the soup as it's cooking. I've made this recipe with ground turkey, and it comes out perfectly fine. The ground turkey, in fact, has a similar taste to the ground pork with just not quite as much of the fat. And when I was researching this, I also read recipes where families have made these with ground beef, so you could really use probably any kind of meat for your meatballs that you wanted to. Some of the seasonings that I saw, some of the recipes that I saw also used fresh mint in it. I've never had it like that, but it sounds kind of intriguing, so I may try that. And the recipes that had fresh mint also had mint leaves that were put into the broth. So I've got my chicken stock. It was hot before, so it's already kind of moving around. It's simmering, which is what I want. And I'm going to mix my ricotto in here, which again is the paste of tomatoes, onions, carrots, garlic, a little bit of cumin, and breadcrumbs. So I'm just going to go ahead and mix that in here. And this is going to be the stock that I'm going to be simmering my meatballs in. I'm just mixing it around a little bit to kind of combine the ingredients. So it looks kind of like a watery tomato soup. As I mentioned before, the breadcrumbs are adding a toasty flavor to it, and then they're also going to serve to thicken the soup a little bit. One of the earliest episodes for this little cooking show, I did the tomato bread soup, the papa pomodoro. And this mixture, when you're cooking it, it actually looks very similar to the papa pomodoro. And it's conceivable, I think, if you had some leftover papa pomodoro, you could probably use that as a sofrito or a ricotto to start as the base for a flavorful soup. The meatballs, I'm going to just scoop out meat, and the directions, which were transcribed by my mother from her mother, my grandmother, they call for the meatballs to be about the size of a ping pong ball. So that's it. And as you make them, you just drop them into the simmering broth. And this soup, to get the meatballs cooked, is going to need to cook for about, let me see here, about an hour. And I prefer to check a couple of the meatballs for temperature to make sure that they're cooked all the way through. Pork is relatively safe nowadays, but in the past it wasn't always the safest meat to have. And there was a possibility of it being contaminated by bacteria, and you want to make sure that that is all cooked. So the pork wants to be cooked ideally to about 165 degrees. As I'm adding these meatballs in here one by one, though at first the first one was only about halfway covered by the broth, but as the weight of the meatballs is going in there, the level of the liquid in the pot is increasing. So ultimately, when I get all the meatballs in there, they'll all be covered, and they're going to be simmering here for about an hour. This recipe is going to yield about 18 to 20 meatballs. And I do want to emphasize that the rice is going in there raw, This is going to be cooking for, as I mentioned, about an hour, so the rice will have plenty of time to cook during that time. I have seen recipes where people use cooked rice. You know, if you don't think that the rice is going to cook, that's always a possibility, but I've never had an issue with having uncooked rice in my meatballs. You don't want to overwork them, but you do want to have them be smooth, and it is important to drop them in the simmering broth so that they don't disintegrate when you put them into the stock. This soup was always a favorite of my family's, and if you prepare all the ingredients in advance, as I've done, it's relatively quick to pull together, and especially on a fall night or even a winter night, it's really a nice comfort food to have. It's good with a nice crusty loaf of French bread or maybe a green salad to go alongside of it. It also freezes beautifully, and it keeps in the refrigerator. This is one of those things, it's very good the day that you make it, but it's even better the next day because the flavors have a time to kind of mingle and incorporate. I'm almost done with my meatballs here. I just want to check to see if anybody has any questions for me today. And I do have a bowl of this already prepared from the sample or the test batch that I made earlier in the weekend. So as soon as I get all these meatballs in here, I will pull that over to show you what the finished product looks like. Smelling really good in here. I wish some of you were here in my kitchen with me so you could smell this and then share the meal with me when this is all done. I'm just going to give this a little stir to move the meatballs around here in the broth. Again, part of the reason that you have the stock simmering when you put them in here is so that they will start to cook right away and the meat won't disintegrate. So here's one of the earlier ones that I had put in. You can see the color of the meat is already changing to kind of a whitish color. And by the time they're fully cooked after about an hour, they are going to be totally white. And here is what the finished product looks like. You can see the soup, it's kind of like a thin stock, you know, chicken stock with tomatoes. You can see a little bit of sauteed vegetables kind of floating around in there. And then the meatballs themselves don't lose a lot of size when they're cooking. They come out kind of like a whitish color, and you can see the herbs in there and the grains of rice. And it's really a very, very delicious and traditional recipe that I really hope you will try when it gets cooler. It's been quite hot here. Yesterday it was 96 degrees here, which is very unusual for us, and I know it's been hot in other parts of the country, but I do see even in Colorado that you're expecting snow tomorrow. So as those nights get longer and the evenings get a little bit cooler, please give this recipe a try. And for this week, that is it from Joan's Kitchen. Albondigas, pork tomato soup with pork meatballs in it. And enjoy. I'll see you next week. Ciao for now.